How are you, folks? Dave Brown back here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. Now, it has been approximately 2.5 years since we have the start of this Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I have covered it. I have made several videos on the topic, but I don't like making videos too often because day to day, not a whole lot changes. Now, there are some channels that do updates every day, twice a day, and I find those a little boring because if the conflict line moves 500 meters, do I really care? No, I don't. So I like to focus on things that happen that could actually cause a big shift in the war. And finally, we do have something that happened recently that has changed the dynamic of the war and could really potentially spell the end for Ukraine. And this is the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, where some analysts suggested that they were trying to take a nuclear power plant to use as a negotiation tool with the Russians. If that was their goal, it fell short, and they are kind of bogged down now in that region, and Russia is sort of picking them apart. And meanwhile, in the Donbass, Russia is moving faster and faster. And this has alarmed the West. And one person in particular who it has alarmed is a writer named David Axe, who works for Forbes. And David Axe is one of the biggest pro-Ukrainian propagandists out there. He will repeat anything, no matter how ridiculous it is, if it's good for Ukraine. So I like to use those sources because if they're worried about something, that means things are pretty bad. So we have an article from David Axe I want to go through titled, If Ukraine's Invasion of Russia's Kursk Oblast was a diversion, it has failed. And that headline coming from him, again, means a whole lot because he is propagandist number one who will repeat anything, even if it's absolutely just unbelievable. So he says here, Russian troops advanced into the village of Novooradivka in eastern Ukraine on Wednesday. That puts them within 5 miles of Pokrovsk, a main objective of Russia's nearly year-long eastern offensive. The Ukrainian military doesn't have many extra troops to deploy to the Pokrovsk front. Many of these spare brigades it had a month ago are now participating in Ukraine's surprise invasion of Russia's Kursk Oblast. Ukrainian leaders are finally beginning to grasp the urgency of the balance of forces on the Pokrovsk axis. The situation is extremely difficult. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky conceded on Wednesday. So Russia's advancing, and the troops that they needed to slow this advance are not there. They are in the Kursk Oblast, bogged down. And this is, as the Ukrainian president says, very difficult or extremely difficult. He goes on to say, when the Ukrainian command, headed by General Alexander Syrsky, opted to invade Kursk with a strong force of thousands of troops drawn from 8 or more brigades, it surprised some observers. Why weren't those troops reinforcing Pokrovsk instead? One generous reading of Ukrainian strategy in Kursk is that the invasion was meant to draw Russian regiments away from the east, relieving the pressure on Pokrovsk. In that sense, the invasion of Kursk may have been a diversion. If so, it failed. The offensive in the Kursk region not only failed to prompt the redeployment of some Russian forces from Donetsk, but also exacerbated the shortage of Ukrainian personnel in the region, the pro-Ukraine conflict intelligence team concluded. Instead of rushing its best troops into Kursk to blunt the Ukrainian advance, the Kremlin scraped together a motley counter-invasion force, including many young and poorly trained conscripts. These reinforcements have slowed down but not halted the Ukrainian invasion. More importantly, the Russian strategy, they allowed the Kremlin to keep its Eastern Front forces intact. So one thing they like to do is always describe Russian soldiers as being poorly trained young conscripts. Now, if this is the case, and that these are all poorly trained young conscripts, what does that say about this invasion force of some of the best Ukrainian fighters that this this motley crew of or motley group of fighters has slowed them down and is really put them at a standstill? So are they really all poorly trained? Well, we know that some of the Chechens are there. Some former Wagnerites are there in that region fighting back. So no, these aren't all just poorly trained conscripts. Some of them are very well trained, and Ukraine is paying a price for what they did. But more importantly, David Axe is admitting that by doing this, by going there, they drew those troops away from the Donbass, and Russia did not overreact by pulling people from the Donbass. They left them there to continue their offensive there. So that diversion in the Kursk region, if it was meant to pull troops from the Donbass, it did not work, and it was a failure. And this might turn out in the long run to backfire big time, because every day we're seeing more and more towns get swallowed up in the Donbass, and some very important towns are right there at the edge. If they go, big problems for Ukraine. And then, again, David Axe, propagandist, pro-Ukraine, he tries to cope a little bit with this part of this article where he talks about the losses that Russia is incurring. And he says the optimistic outcome for the Ukrainians is that the general staff in Kiev finds forces to bolster the lines outside of Kursk, and that these forces bleed the Russian brigades and regiments until they simply can't sustain their advance. It is not an impossible task. The Russians are losing hundreds of people and dozens of vehicles every day in the east. Enemy losses on the Prokrovsk direction have remained at a record high for the fifth week, according to the Ukrainian Center for Defense Strategies. But no one knows for sure when such high losses will become too high for the Russian military. In a fit of optimism late last year, the Estonian Defense Ministry predicted that Ukraine could turn the tide of the war in 2024 by killing or maiming 100,000 Russians in 12 months. In fact, Ukraine probably killed or maimed 100,000 Russians in just the first 6 months of the year, and yet Russia keeps attacking and keeps advancing toward Pokrovsk. So, again, this idea that's put out there of these Russian meat waves where they're just rushing forward to be slaughtered, and no matter how many of them are slaughtered, they just keep coming. Now, which country has hundreds of videos on Telegram showing men being ripped off the streets, forced into vans with their loved ones, their wives, their girlfriends, their mothers, beating the windows, trying to pull them out? Which country has that problem? That's Ukraine. And those videos are, they're really sad to see somebody fighting for his life, literally, because once he's in that van, he's going to the front in 2, 3, or 4 weeks, and he's done. And that's why they're obviously fighting not to go. And all of that is coming from Ukraine. I haven't seen one video from Russia of people being pulled off the streets. And both countries have the same law, which is that you can't record this stuff. But in Ukraine, apparently, it's been recorded hundreds of times and uploaded to places like Telegram and X or Twitter. So when you look at the evidence, which side is incurring all these horrific losses, Ukraine or Russia? And he says here, 100,000 killed or maimed in 6 months. 6 months. So that's something like 15,000 to 18,000 killed and maimed, which meaning unable to return to combat every month. If that was actually happening, we would know that. that Russia could not continue their effort the way it's been going now without a general mobilization if they were incurring those types of losses, because that doesn't include other wounded people as well. We're talking killing and maiming, so off the battlefield. So 100,000 in 6 months, I simply don't buy that. And then that again is the cope coming from Western propagandists who are trying to explain how Russia's advancing. Russia's not advancing because they're smart, because they have good tactics, because they figured things out, because they have the advantage in artillery or air power. No, that's not why they're advancing. They're advancing because they're committing mass suicide in these humongous meat waves. And at this point in the war, pushing that theory or saying that's happening is just ridiculous. So David Axe admits that this gambit in the Kursk region has been a failure, but then he has to compensate by saying, well, they are advancing the Donbass, the Russians, but they've lost 100,000 maimed and killed in 6 months. So how long can they keep up this effort? Well, because that's not true, they can keep this effort up forever or indefinitely. So we might be now finally seeing a turning in this war where Ukraine tried this maneuver, it failed, it backfired, it's spread them thin, and maybe Russia now will sort of just roll up the Donbass. Now, will that happen? It's been 2.5 years. Who knows? There are people, saying that this war would be over a year ago who were wrong. So for the pro-Russian side, some of those more optimistic forecasts or predictions didn't pan out. This has been a slow, grinding war, and I don't think that's going to change. Now, when it comes to that strategy of a war of attrition, which is clearly what Russia is doing, there is a downside. And the downside is that the longer your enemy stays in the fight, it gives them more opportunity to do crazy things, to do unpredictable things. And there is an inherent danger in that. So it's not saying that it's the wrong strategy. I think it's probably the best strategy for Russia, considering that they weren't ready for a long war. They didn't have the personnel. They didn't have the equipment ready. And they really had to sit back after that initial invasion and rebuild their army over a period of a year to a year and a half. So they had to do that because they weren't ready for it. So it may have been the best strategy to slow things down and be methodical. But again, the longer your enemy hangs around, sometimes they can get lucky and do something that can hurt you. And that's my concern as this war sort of not winds down, but as Russia gobbles up more territory. What will Ukraine do in desperation? What will the West do in desperation? Is the West willing to take the L and go, okay, we spent $300 billion. It's been 2.5 years. We lost. Russia got the Donbass. They got what they wanted, and we just have to walk away. Can the West do that? Well, the wild card is the U.S. election. Whoever wins that election will be very impactful as far as how this war might end. If Trump's elected, perhaps they negotiate and try to find a resolution to this. And now with RFK Jr. on the side, as well as Tulsi Gabbard, who joined him because he is anti-war and he's running on stopping the war, there is a lot of pressure for Trump to actually do that. So if Trump is elected, that might happen. If Kamal is elected, that's a worst case scenario. Then I think they will continue to just keep feeding weapons and money into this Ukraine project as long as the Ukrainians are willing to keep fighting and dying. And that's what the tragedy here is that ultimately it's the Ukrainians who are fighting to the last Ukrainian. So when Lindsey Graham made that comment, we're going to fight to the last Ukrainian, I cringed and winced because the United States ultimately is making no sacrifice. It's the people of Ukraine who are dying in the hundreds of thousands. So Lindsey Graham, he is a sick man, and I apologize to the world generally for this senator from South Carolina who really seems to revel in these wars that have killed millions of people. So sorry about Lindsey Graham. He's our fault, and I wish he would go away sooner than later. Well, that is it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.